Good evening from Central Pennsylvania. I want to thank our return listeners and welcome those who are joining us for the first time. I'm your host, Ed Mann, Director of Training and Education for Provident. Tonight, I have the opportunity and pleasure to host Chris Naum, who has to be one of the most traveled humans I know. Chris and I have crossed paths at numerous national events over the years. Last year, while attending the Volunteer Combination Officer Section Symposium in the Sun, in passing, we chatted about him doing a webinar, and here we are. I will have Chris introduce himself after I review some information about Provident and what we can do to help you and your organizations. Provident was started as an independent insurance agency in 1902 in the Pittsburgh area of Pennsylvania. In 1928, the company began serving volunteer fire departments with customized insurance policies, in particular to protect volunteers when they got hurt doing something for their fire department. Today, we provide volunteer combination and career departments and emergency medical responders with a multitude of programs. We also now offer our accident and health and accidental death and dismemberment program to law enforcement across the country. Once again, this is the seventh year in a row. Pennsylvania or Provident was voted by the Central Pennsylvania Journal for Business as one of the best places to work in PA. Some of the programs that we offer are accident and health program, to insurance to protect your people. And if you're an accident health client or become an accident health client, your members and their immediate family members would have access to our first responder assistance program. We also offer a 24-hour accidental death and dismemberment policy, which provides a death benefit to your members both on and off duty, along with some other benefits, a group term life policy, critical illness and cancer policy, which would cover you for a heart attack, stroke, renal failure, or you're diagnosed with cancer. And then, of course, our Fire Plus property and casualty program, where we insure your things. If you're a property and casualty client or become a property and casualty client, you would have access to our Fire Plus Academy, which is actually operated by Lexipol through Fire Rescue One, and it has over 800 courses. Something I forgot to mention under our accident health, in probably about 26 or 27 states right now, we offer an optional cancer rider for your members. And those benefit amounts can range anywhere from $2,500 to $100,000, and it's an optional benefit. And the nice thing about it is you don't have to make a presumption or prove that you got the cancer doing something for the fire department. If you're diagnosed with the original diagnosis or first-time diagnosis with a specific type of cancer, it would pay the benefit. And on April the 27th, I'll have a panel of fire chiefs from across the country. I think we have 6 or 7 panelists, and we're going to talk to people who were awarded the John Buckman Leadership Award by Provident, and we're going to talk about what makes a good leader great. That's April the 27th. Tonight, as I said, Chris Naum's with us to talk about the Fireground Blueprint, reading, buildings, risk, and lessons. And I got to tell you, this is probably one area of the fire service that I am weak on. And I would almost imagine there are a lot of folks with us tonight, if they were being honest, would agree that they have a weakness there as well. So I'm going to stop sharing. Chris, if you want to turn your camera on and introduce yourself to our guest and start your program, it's all yours.
All right, very good. Thanks so very much, Ed. Welcome, everybody. Again, Chris Naum from upstate New York, Chief of Training of the Command Institute, 4 decades plus in the fire service. Started off as a backstep firefighter in 1975. So when you do the math and do the numbers, I am one of those guys, I guess. But it certainly doesn't feel that way. I still feel and can remember riding that backstep on my first working fire and heading down the road in a whole different era of time and a whole different perspective of the fire service. Have had really the privilege to work in a variety of capacities over the last 50 plus years. Currently a technical advisor and subject matter expert with the NIOSH Firefighter Line of Duty Death Program. I've had the opportunity to work in a variety of capacities, both in field operations and training, admin, research at the community college level. Spent a number of years at the National Fire Academy as an instructor, and have been currently working in a variety of capacities nationally as a consultant and contributor to a variety of different activities, both in the private sector and in the municipal fire service sector. I currently do quite a bit with Fire Engineering Magazine and fireengineering.com. I've been actively involved with them for a number of years and currently have a monthly podcast and a webcast program that is called the Buildings on Fire podcast, where we specifically look at and talk about all issues dealing with the built environment, fireground operations, and the integrated perspective on safety and operations. I've had the pleasure to work with ISFSI for a number of years, going all the way back to my formative years as an initial member back in 1982, and served as a vice president with the organization, and also had the distinct pleasure of working with the fine staff on the Safety and Health Committee with the IAFC on the Safety, Health, and Survival section. So just a little brief synopsis on that background. And really, I'm actually the only other thing that has relevancy here when we talk about the aspects of building construction. I actually worked and became an architect and a fire protection engineer in alignment with my fire service background. Got out of architecture a number of years back, continued down the academic and fire protection engineering side for a number of years, worked in nuclear generation and industrial safety, human performance also. So quite a well-rounded background, and certainly bring a lot to the table when we talk about the issues dealing with the built environment. And we'll get into that as we get into our program. So I'm going to, let's get our program brought up here. And again, let me just say, it's not about me. It's about our shared need for sound technical information and knowledge out there. And we talk about structural firefighting. It has everything to do with the built environment. So let's get ourselves situated. And I think we're good, unless I hear otherwise. So again, we've got in front of us here a topic that certainly is a necessary topic, but one that certainly cannot be covered within the limitations of the time frame for this particular webinar. We talk about the predictability of building performance. Our program here is really surrounding a couple of different topical areas, but the predictability of building performance on the structural fireground. The fireground blueprint is something that we have sort of honed in on as our template, of which everything that involves construction and the built environment and many of the other correlating areas of operations on the fireground are drawn out of that. The fireground blueprint becomes the template from which our incident action plans are developed. And in this instance here this evening, we're going to talk about reading the building, some concepts surrounding that, some aspects dealing with the acronym of FACTS, F-A-C-T-S, risks, and in between all of that, we'll talk about lessons, learnings, some of the insights that are drawn out of the hard lessons that come out of the fireground, both the near misses, the close calls, the significant and minor injuries that sometimes are pretty minor to say the least, but also may be a career debilitating, and certainly those issues that do lead to line of duty deaths. We'll be talking about building construction, manage risk, aggressive tactics, operations, very much in an integrated perspective here as we get into our program. I did give you some of that background. Again, the rest of it you guys can Google out and so forth. But again, my appreciation here to Ed and the staff and to Provident for the opportunity here to be in front of you. I know as I was watching the individuals, as everyone was logging in, we have quite a cadre of representation across the United States, and I've been very fortunate to have traveled throughout the U.S. This is my 39th year of instructing nationally across the U.S. and North America. And again, for some of you, I've been in your backyards, and for many of you that may be first-time listeners to some of our advocacy or our content, our models, and some of our concepts here, again, just sort of strap in, just listen to it, because there's going to be quite a bit of soak time. And for many of the other listeners that are have been followers of our programs and our stand-up deliveries and some of our webinars and podcasts and so forth, again, welcome. So actually, a little bit of a shout out to some of my colleagues up in Nova Scotia on the international side, and actually also to Rick George in South Dakota, who I am aware has a large contingent at his firehouse doing some in-service drill training. Our program here, again, when we talk about the Fireground Blueprint, talks about building performance on today's Fireground. It is a part of a very large-scale series of which one component is reading the building. We get into construction issues, tactics, operations. As you can see, again, it's a variety of different insights, both for the first due officer, commander. We've developed a number of models dealing with the FACTS model, which we'll explain a little bit further. Reading the building, I think many of you have become familiar with the concept and the terminology. We actually were the first to originate that term back almost 20, actually about 25 years ago, late 1990s, early 2000s, when we first started doing some blogging and online applications in the early days of social media. And again, we'll talk a little bit about the predictability of building performance, a little bit on the aspects of building read, size up, risk assessment. We will touch upon the tactical windows, of which everything in today's Fireground, and especially when we talk about building performance, revolve around the elapse of time. So just put that in the back of your heads. And then also integrated with the delta time, or the elapse of time, we'll talk about the importance of human performance related aspects on operations, construction risks, and some of those other aspects. So our program, again, is one very small facet. We are just going to scratch the surface in this particular program. But again, this is part of our national lecture series. And the only plug I'll make, again, these programs, both in a variety of different longevity in terms of time and duration and content, are available for hosting throughout this year and certainly into next year, 27 and 28. Key items here in our overview. Again, we're going to look at an integrated approach toward building construction. I think many of us are familiar with the standpoint that when we do have a presentation, whether it be an in-service or stand-up program, whether it be in a conference setting, academic setting, or again in a drill setting, typically we hear the same type of content. The curriculum, the content, the types of things that are constantly discussed when we revolve around the focused area of building construction are pretty linear. They are not integrated into the other associated areas when we talk about operations, safety, and risk. And certainly we're becoming more familiar with the aspects of introducing fire dynamics within that model. So we're going to be talking about those elements. This is a very short form program, probably even shorter than I would have liked. We were talking earlier before we started off the program. We originally built the presentation around a particular time frame, which I will not say as I look at the clock here for the moment, but we did introduce some additional content over the course of the afternoon, and have actually sort of expanded the program in a much more sizable standpoint than time allows. So with that being said, we may jump around a little bit as I monitor the clock here as we start approaching the closing time frame. So we will talk about the aspects of the concept of predictability. I'll say this: all buildings are predictable if we understand the roadmap, understand some of the fundamentals that are drawn out of that, and we'll explain how those aspects of the modeling have a profound influence on our decision making, both on the first arrival at the company level, on the arrival of the command officer who may be, again, assuming command based upon the first due companies that have arrived. We'll talk about the importance of both the exterior, the size up that we're very familiar with, the 360. We'll also introduce a little bit of conversation here about interior size up. It's something that we've expanded upon significantly more in our presentations, both in our writings as well as our presentations. And that's something that I truly believe is the next phase of conversation when we talk about reading the building, sizing up. There's both interior and exterior size up. There's certainly both company level size up and command size up. So there's four different facets here. And again, we'll introduce some of the elements here when we talk about tactical windows, the elapse of time or delta time, and the integration of human performance elements. And again, just critical thinking, expand your knowledge, skills, and abilities, and take this as an opportunity to sort of reboot We're going to talk about aligning and connecting the unique variables and the new perspective of operations, try to simplify the complexity of the built environment. One thing that is common when we talk about building construction, it is not certainly one of the most embraced topics on the Fireground, but I'll say this, it is the most important topic when we talk about the structural Fireground. If we're talking about fighting fires in occupancies and in buildings, the most significant influencing factor in our decision making and in our tactical task level operations and engagement is to have a profound level of knowledge and understanding of the building that we are engaging within. And I can't say that any simpler. And as I get sort of warmed up here in our conversation, it is the most important element. And again, it's also one of the most neglected topical areas within the fire service and continues to be such when we take a look at all of the other certainly important subject areas. But again, when we talk about showing up on the Fireground, the easy thing is showing up and going to work and stretching the line. The difficult and challenging aspects is to do that with critical thinking, conservative bias, and having both building and fire literacy. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So we'll talk about methodologies, processes. And again, we're going to crawl before we run here. A lot of immersive information here. We're going to try to connect the dots. And again, there's going to be some soak time to be able to comprehend. And I'll say this to everybody. So again, I apologize, but I don't apologize coming out of New York when I talk about use guys. It's certainly nothing offensive and so forth. It's a New York thing, but it is inclusive of everyone from any gender and so forth. But it is much more than showing up. The easy thing is when we show up and go to work, stretching the line and going to work. The challenging part is taking a look at all the other critical factors that are right in front of us when we talk about the fire and the building to figure out what and how we should do things and when we should do things and how much time we have to do them relative to our operations. A couple of tech items here right up from the get-go. So a couple of things here. So we'll have a couple of reference and resources documents here. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but there will be some information that'll be transmitted out and through email, through Provident. And again, we'll provide some resources that'll help you, and we'll also indicate a couple of other resources. But probably one of the best takeaways out of our program here, aside from the content, is making you aware of probably the best. Actually, I don't want to say maybe, it is the best building construction book for the fire service as a non-fire service book. So this book is written specifically for the architectural and engineering profession, but specifically for architects. The 7th edition, Francis Ching, C-H-A-N-G, Building Construction Illustrated. It is the best non-fire service related book out there. I encourage you to purchase the current edition. Also, the previous editions, the 5th and 6th editions, can be purchased online through a variety of different sources. Amazon.com, again, has these readily available. And in many instances, both new and older editions can be purchased for a very, very cost-effective amount of money. So again, if you haven't heard of this book, it is the book to get. It is a companion to many other books that are out there when we talk about the technical library that one should have, certainly as a company officer and certainly as a command officer. This book should be on your personal library shelf and certainly should be on the shelf in quarters at your fire halls, your fire stations, and training environments. In addition to that, the other documents that you should be reading and certainly be familiar with that go beyond the cursory, rudimentary types of books that are out there. We'll talk a bit more about training documentation and the limitations of resources when we talk about building construction. It is overwhelming, certainly to say the least. It is highly technical, but it certainly is the most needed subject area when we talk about engaging on today's Fireground. The other books are the NFPA Fire Protection Handbook, the SFPE Fire Engineering Handbook, and then also the after action reports from departments and organizations throughout the North Americas, and also the NIOSH reports, line of duty death and the near misses. If you are not reading those, not line of duty death, if you've never put your hands on those, then I can only ask why not. And if you've been in the fire service for maybe a short period of time, I'll give you some latitude on that. But if you've been in the fire service anywhere beyond a year or more, the question is, why aren't you reading them? Why are you not knowledgeable and competent in understanding the lessons and learnings and the ability to apply those on today's Fireground? So again, must reads all the way around. A couple of other documents here, the American Home, especially focusing in on the residential structures. The American Home by Lester Walker, The Field Guide to the American House by Virginia McAllister. the Firefighter Battle Space series by Vincent Dunn, Chief Dunn. And then also, again, one of the other critical linchpins here is The Collapse of Burning Buildings, second edition or the first edition by Chief Dunn. And again, although it's an older edition, an older book, again, these are very imperative books to have to gain the kind of literacy and insights relative to the buildings, design, configurations, the layouts, those things that influence occupancy type, occupancy risk, and building anatomy and building construction. I'll also bring to your attention a couple of other documents here. The NFPA 1700 Guide to Structural Firefighting, first published in 2020, right during COVID, so many of you may not even be familiar with that. The latest edition was just published here in December, so the 2026 edition. This does correlate and align much of what is learned and the insights coming out of R&D from UL and from NIST. But also, again, provide some templates that connect the dots here with some of our modeling that, again, we've been working with for the last 20 plus years. But it is the next phase, a next step forward to integrate some identified concepts, suggested templates to be able to take a look at them to see how they will fit into your organization, your first due or community or jurisdictional response area risks. It has everything to do with what are your current, immediate, or future risks as they relate to the built environment. Excuse me. Two other documents here that, again, are useful resources. The USAR National Task Force Field Operations Guide provide a wealth of information on the technical side, dealing with buildings and materials, especially when we talk about being able to utilize them in size up from the safety officer standpoint, and certainly at the command level when we talk about gaining not only an understanding of the building, but also the insights that are necessary when we talk about the types of both building, structural, and occupancy loads, the fire loads in the structures and so forth. It's all about, again, how will that building maintain its integrity and how will it allow us to operate within that structure for our mission critical tasks. And then lastly, the Architectural Graphic Standard, although written for the architectural profession, again, a wealth of very detailed information to gain insights that you will not find in any of the current technical manuals or textbooks that are out there that are dedicated for the fire service. And there lies the problem. There is no one definitive fire service book that will give you all of the insights and information that are necessary to gain the knowledge, skills, and abilities that come through experience, but to develop some of the skill set proficiencies to understand how buildings are built, some of the associated challenges that come out of those particular structures, and then build upon that when we talk about the applications of fire dynamics, fire ground conditions, and so forth that are part of our model. So those are some of the topical areas. And then lastly, the handouts that we're going to distribute out to everyone that are part of the program. Again, we'll have some specifics dealing with some building facts modeling, some items here dealing with the tactical aspects of the tactical windows, some other integrated perspectives, and then a standalone cheat sheet that'll give you some guidance on that. For those of you that want to follow up for some additional information, I know that they're going to publish on the website some contact information. From my standpoint, my email address is up there. Feel free to jot that down. We'll provide my cell phone number. So again, for those of you that may be looking for additional information as shown on the screen, both in suggested reading, some other referencing, some more in-depth information on some of the topical areas, please reach out to me in a variety of forms, and we'll do what is necessary to bring that information into your hands. So I do, again, make myself readily available for that type of one-on-one conversations online or through direct phone calls and emails. And certainly, if you're ever at any of the conferences, I'll be up at FDIC here in a couple of weeks. Feel free to reach out to me in advance or catch me on the floor somewhere to have a chat about some of the items here. Although I'm not going to get into too much detail, we have a very, very robust and large presence on social media, both with our blog sites, our websites. We're currently going through a very extensive integration of those. So again, across the board on social media, I believe some of those links will be made available. I did write for Firehouse Magazine for a number of years, actually 25 years. We had a column that was present for a number of years. Some of those columns that deal with the predictability of building performance and construction are still available. Our podcasting are available on the archive section of fireengineering.com. There's a wealth of information that goes back numerous years on a variety of different topical areas. everything from, again, size up ops. We did a 6-part series on the commercial Fireground, on type 3 construction, a variety of different series, multiple part series on developing size up literacy, inside and out, predictability. Just about everything that we are going to be touching upon here are available in some very lengthy and very detailed, and in many instances, multiple part series that expand on a number of years of presentation and publication. So take a look at those. We've got an online presence with our social media, some of our lecture series. We actually do walking tours and take the classroom out into the streets. So if you're interested in some of that, again, we'll just as a point of contact. And then lastly, again, email address, cell phone number. I'll leave that up for a quick moment here as I slow myself down a bit before we get into the program. So again, this should not be a termination of your insights and the development of your skill sets, whether you're a couple of weeks onto the job, a couple of years, whatever rank, role, and responsibilities you have. As long as you are in the job, you need to be learning about your buildings because there is a constant challenge on what is evolving in terms of the emerging construction and materials, the methods and materials of construction, and everything that we're trying to play catch up on. It's a challenge and it's never ending. So with that being said, I'm going to take a quick sip of some coffee here and I take a quick breath here. And again, I don't have anybody to slow me down, so I'm going to keep this moving along in a very brisk pace. We've got a lot of material to cover, but again, the information here in the program, you'll be able to take a look at the recording and utilize that sort of at a slower pace at the convenience of what time you may have in the future to sort of listen again to some of the content, take a look at some of the visuals. I'll also make mention for those of you that may have an interest, although we will not supply this globally for all of the participants, if some of you have a particular defined need for some of the content area, whether it be on the tactical windows, whether it be on the predictability, there's quite a few templates here. We're just going to be, again, talking about some high level perspectives here, but just reach out to me through email or through texting, and we'll see what we can do to get you some excerpts in a PDF format that will provide some additional information. We do have a number of things upcoming here with some different organizations that, again, we'll be publishing and making notifications of in the upcoming couple of months. So you'll be able to actually see quite a bit more content online. We actually had quite a bit of a hiatus in our online presence due to our very slow progress of getting our blog sites and websites back up. But stay tuned. You'll see a lot of good stuff, and we're back into the writing phases. We have a video series that's coming up that'll be short vignettes on building construction that are all video based. So with that being said, let's talk about, again, performance, facts, first arriving, construction, tactics, and safety. Let's talk about the 3 critical elements that everything filters into regarding today's Fireground. It has everything to do with the building, the compartment, and the company. And these are fundamental and are integral to today's Fireground that are really part of the building blocks of understanding the aspects of predictability performance and actually lead to the development and the integration of building reads. So when we talk about the first arriving, and again, there's quite a bit of dialogue, discussion, debate about what is that critical window. And I'll say this: the most critical window, and this is based on best practices across the United States, is 10 minutes of elapsed time on the Fireground. But that 10 minutes of elapsed time, when we take a look at engagement operations, reflex, response time, arrival time, precursors to getting from apparatus to curb to building, again, there's quite a bit of time elapsed that occurs. But typically we talk about the 10-minute window, the 10 to 15 to 20-minute window, and we'll explain a little bit more about that. But the first arriving has everything to do with construction that influences tactics, that influence safety and or risk. And when we talk about safety, we're talking about managing the levels of risk to ensure that we have as an efficient of a safety conscious work environment in an environment that is inherently unsafe. The fact that we are working within hostile environments where building conditions, structural elements of that building, the integrity, are being affected by a variety of different fire dynamics and parameters. Sometimes just age and gravity and deterioration are our main challenges there. But again, construction and building and occupancy risks do influence our decision making. They influence our tactical engagement and integration, and thus they also influence the incident action plan and influence the degree of safety, the inherent or perceived or introduced risk that may be present, but it has everything to do with the first arriving, construction, tactics, and safety. And that is part of the fundamentals of the building facts model. So as we get into these conversations here, we talk about performance. It has everything to do with the building. We talk about the building conditions, and there's a whole variety. We'll introduce and expand upon the concept of era and vintage. Some of you may have heard that being utilized quite a bit more over the last number of years. We were, again, the first to introduce the concept of era and vintage going all the way back to 1999 and early 2000s. It certainly has become institutionalized to a great extent, because now when we talk about building reads, we talk about the building, we're now starting to focus in on sort of an expansion and integration of size up, which again has always been rather outdated. We talk about its originations back in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and really has not changed dramatically, although we are limited in our availability of time to get into the historical context of the origination of size up. It's safe to say that, I'll say this, actually size up originated in the first edition of the IASC's Fire Chief's Handbook in 1932, and it was promulgated from insights that were developed over 100 years ago. So in the mid 1920s through and up to 1930 and 32, leading up to the publication. That publication in 1932 first introduced the concepts of size up and introduced some of the attributes that still exist today. But it wasn't until Lloyd Lehman in 1950 started talking about the aspects of size up as a model and as a process that, again, has remained relatively unchanged all the way to today and influences much on today's Fireground. But the relationship of the building, the relationship of the compartment, all buildings have at least one compartment. We may have a structure in a building, it has an enclosure, and it's just one room. That becomes the compartment. Or we have buildings that have numerous compartments that are interconnected, that have some degree of reliance, interconnectivity, both vertical and horizontal, and that's critical to have an understanding. But when we talk about building and compartment, those are critical to the components of the comprehension, the understanding, and the application of building reads, both external and internal. And then lastly, the relationship of the company. We talk about human performance, the availability and the capabilities of the company also are important to understand that they also have a tremendous degree of influence on decision making, the development of the incident action plan, the identification of tactical deployments, and the actual execution of the task level. And again, if we have consistency, there's a different variable that may be there. But in most instances, we have a tremendous degree of variables relative to the human performance, capabilities of the company. Thus, there's a significant variable that now becomes part of what we do, how we do it, when we do it, sometimes the things that we shouldn't be doing on the Fireground. So it's important to take a look at that. And again, just a real quick look at the integration. We talk about, again, the aspects of building performance, the compartment of the company. All buildings have compartments, and the important other aspect here is the concept of resiliency. We're going to talk about identifying characteristics of the building's RIT, the RIT of a building. So that has nothing to do with saving our own or dealing with firefighter safety and so forth, but it has everything to do with the predictability of performance of the building, because all buildings have a degree of RIT, resiliency, integrity, and time, the elapse of time, the integrity that's affected by fire, and how that plays out in some of the learned attributes that are part of that particular component. The compartment is where we go to typically a compartment, whether it be an occupiable type space or an internal compartment that may be a void or concealed area. Those are typically the location in which we have fire dynamics or products of a combustion present. It's where the company goes to, where we have engagement. And again, company, capabilities, resources, and risk. Those are very important concepts that we expand upon when we put these things together. So when we talk about those elements, again, it's building compartment, the fire dynamics, fire conditions, three critical components of building, compartment, fire, and company. When we talk about the aspects of the compartment here, it's also important to note, and I'll just say this up front, many of you have become familiar with the perspectives and reads of the compartment and of the fire when we talk about reading the fire or reading smoke. So again, this was an introduced concept that Chief Dotson was very gracious to identify and correlate and then develop the modeling, and that has become a critical, again, aspect relative to a Fireground reads. But we've expanded upon that. So again, when we talk about building reads, there's also the compartment and fire reads. There's also company level reads, just taking a look at the capabilities composition. What do I have in terms of the personnel that are in front of me? And that's a critical element, both on the volunteer and also on the career side. When we expand upon that and take a look at that and how it plays into our building reads and taking a look at risk, the other element here also that's part of that, again, predictability of building performance, the acronym of BEAR. When we talk about building anatomy, era, and vintage, the anatomy of the structure relative to a variety of different subsets, and the risk factors, the compartment fire conditions, the RIT, resiliency, integrity, and time, and also the incident, severity, urgency, and growth, thus the acronym of SUG, severity, urgency, and growth. It's a simplified aspect to take a look at the conditions that we are encountering upon arrival, the conditions that we are projecting, and sometimes trying to postulate and predict based upon where this condition may be relative to the fire within the compartment, fire within the room, fire within the floor, fire within the building, or the expanding nature of that incident into other structures and occupancy that may be part of a larger footprint to the building. So simplified aspects of building integrity, structural aspects to allow us to operate in, around, on top, next to, or underneath the building, the aspects of RIT. There is compartment RIT, there's also building RIT. And then again, severity, the urgency, and growth, and we'll expand upon this as we get into the program. Company level knowledge, skills, and human performance, and then the aspects of time when we talk about RIT. Everything on the Fireground has to do with the aspects of fire, products of combustion, building integrity, predictability, performance, as they relate to the elapse of time in our integration in that operation on the Fireground. And then lastly, the other aspect, which is critical when we talk about the aspects of fire suppression, the sustainability of having the adequacy of flow rates. When we talk about controlling the compartment, controlling the floor, controlling the building. So those relations are pretty straightforward. The building compartment relationships sometimes can be vague, or sometimes when we take a look at those factors, we can understand them very much so. So again, something as dynamic as this, when we take a look at just a very quick video clip here of a compartment fire, of a building fire, fire dynamics, the aspects that we are learning more about in terms of the dynamics of fire, inlet, outlet, exhaust flow paths, and so forth. And again, if I'm watching and looking at the ladder there, the implications on companies and human performance, safety, and risk that are in front of us, maybe not to this extent each and every call, but the unexpectedness of what can happen on today's Fireground. We talk about the fire load packages, the building fire load, all of the other aspects that come together, along with occupancy type and occupancy risk, another concept here to introduce. So it's not just a residential occupancy. That residential occupancy may have inherent risk factors that are associated with some other attributes that we will talk about here today. So something, again, as dynamic as what we're seeing and we're witnessing here. But again, when we talk about the dynamics on the Fireground, whether it be older types of structures that have a very dominant type of resiliency and integrity in time, they allow us to do some things that were not time dependent. And sometimes we don't have to have a tremendous degree of knowledge beyond the standpoint that we identify the building, the type of construction, some of the other attributes relative to its building anatomy. We know that we recognize some fire dynamics conditions are showing, and we normally put that together through the varied levels of experience that we've gained. And sometimes we're showing up with maybe a less than adequately trained or experienced company and we stretch the line and go to work. It truly is the brute force related aspects that allow us to engage, make the grabs, put these fires out with very little building construction knowledge other than what we maybe have limitedly attained through our firefighter 1 and 2 and maybe a little bit in our fire officer training. But again, for many of you that have gone through the academies, whether it be of recent or back in the day, we are willfully limiting the type of necessary training that one needs to obtain. The formal training coupled with the on-the-job training, when we talk about in-service training, getting out in the streets, learning on the job, we've got to have a lot of front-loaded knowledge, skills, and abilities that are coupled with training and coupled with a Fireground experience that come together that really make us more literate than illiterate. And we'll talk a little bit more about literacy and functionality here. So again, when we talk about the variety of structures and buildings, both new and old, we're showing up in the street, the demands that are there, looking at the conditions, understanding the occupancy status of that structure, and then being able to go to work and operate, whether it be residential, commercial, the industrial types of conditions, those that are challenging at best, showing up. Certainly for those of you that may have kept track of what's occurring nationally, 1.2 million square foot warehouse out in California, again, arson related, apparent arson related type fire. But when the entire structure is consumed in the entirety, and the only thing that's remaining are the perimeter walls, that's certainly something that, and again, in a protected property. So again, we talk about fire load packages, the occupancy risk, and other related inherent or introduced conditions that ultimately influence the building from a compromise and collapse. And the important connection here is, where are we when these bad things end up happening, whether it be from a fire behavior or operational standpoint from a building. And again, even just the residential structures, they continue to increase in size. We'll introduce a couple of concepts here in our program, talking about the evolution of some of our residences. But again, we'll talk about, mega mansions and giga mansions and tetra mansions, large area residentials. We'll talk about the mini mansions. And again, all of these have some very specific functionality, predictability. They have certain types of layouts that one has to study that may be present in your first due, or sometimes even in your mutual aid response area, that you've got to front load that knowledge ability, have an understanding on something that goes beyond the cursory conversation of lightweight construction. We're talking about engineered structural systems, whether they be in the residentials or in the hybrid commercial buildings. And yes, sometimes we actually have residential buildings that truly are performing such as commercial structures, but without all of the necessary code enhancements that one would find in a commercial structure. But we can have a 10,000 square foot residential building, which is dramatically different than a 10,000 square foot commercial building. And again, now we talk about the challenges of building reads. Do we have an understanding of the compartments, of the orientation, of the layouts, configurations, what's common to the types of roof systems that may be present, what's common to the public and the semi-public or the private areas within residential or commercial or other types of structures and occupancies. There are very precise aspects of design considerations that come out of architectural attributes and engineering attributes, the layouts, configurations. And again, these are part of having that building literacy to be able to contribute toward being able to read the building. Thus the correlation and tie-in back into the Fireground blueprint. It's understanding how these buildings are built, constructed, methods and materials that now become part of our reads, going beyond the obvious, being able to pick up on those things that are going to be mission critical toward our operations. And again, the importance of survivability and risk relative to those aspects within the structure. Operational excellence, just a couple of other notes here. We talk about mission focus, the three critical elements: building, compartment, fire conditions in the company. Those are mission critical when we talk about execution driven, results oriented Fireground, and the relationship of both the firehouse and the Fireground. It certainly goes without saying that when we talk about all of these elements here, they also come back into center when we talk about what we do in the firehouse, what we do in the Fireground, and how that plays out. So again, mission focused accountability, developing those competencies, certainly back in the day, are certainly all part of the job. We talk about operational excellence, and they certainly are as mission focused today as they were back in the day. Some are associated with a great company, others make a company great. Those were the words of the late John Vigiano, who for many years served as a lieutenant on Rescue Company 2 FDNY, retired out as a captain on Ladder Company 132 FDNY. Again, just putting that together. I also want to just take a brief moment here to talk about the corollary relationship between what we do in the firehouse and what goes on the Fireground. And again, I would be remiss if I didn't make this a connection, because it has some applications here when we talk about what and how we do things on the Fireground. Mission focused, when we talk about personnel, the aspect of self, team, and company integrity, tactical identity, grit, rigor, aggressiveness, company discipline, motivation, dedication, being a servant relative to our operations. It is the predictability of performance of the individual, of the team, of the company, thus the correlation back to human performance. It's the agility, mobility, and proficiencies that play out into what we do relative to our Fireground reads and how we thus integrate and engage within that building. So again, it's part of that. It's the knowledge, skills, and ability, the literate and competencies. So again, it's part and parcel when we take a look at that and then tie that back into mission-focused operations. It is the team, it's the company, it's the box alarm, it's company fortitude, tactical resiliency, grit, rigor, aggressiveness, tactical discipline, predictability of performance of the building and the fire, tactical agility, fast water, and again, the other elements, and then inclusive of critical thinking toward our operations. So with that being said, let's just stop for a moment and take a look at the attributes when we talk about yesterday's Fireground. And it's important to understand why today's Fireground is uniquely different. Although we have similar buildings in many instances, we have the buildings that existed, again, 25 years ago in the early 2000s, late 1990s. But again, the buildings that existed in the 90s and the 80s and the 70s, the 60s, 50s, 40s, 30s, 20s. The buildings that existed in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Again, those buildings continue to have performance-related influencers that one has to develop the skill set to identify those reads that are very much era and vintage driven and that are defined by what I call the 5 and 5. So the major takeaway here when we talk about reading the buildings and integrating the building facts model is understanding that there are 5 fundamentals of a building that one is going to identify and make part of our building reads. There are 5 functional aspects of the building that correlate back into that are tied into the learned elements of the building's predictability performance, the aspects of building and compartment RIT, and then the aspects of the fire dynamics and the conditions that we are encountering, whether it be fire-related or the static conditions relative to a structural collapse or an explosion or other weather or environmentally introduced condition that results in us showing up on the Fireground. So again, we can have an environmental impact that results in a building compromise or building collapse that now still has to have the same level of attention and detail in assessing, sizing up, and determining through the building reads of how and what we're going to do relative to our incident action plan. So although we talk a lot about the Fireground, the structural Fireground, the Fireground that we respond to in which a building is involved, an occupancy is involved that may be present, again, there may be a number of influencing factors upon that first due that still require this level of building construction knowledge and the integration of these models and concepts and attributes that we're introducing. So again, why is it that we're having some of this conversation? Why is it that we're just not taking the books that have been around for the last 30, 40 years that in many instances continue to influence what we do on the Fireground? But again, why are we seeing these dramatic changes? So again, when we talk about yesterday's Fireground, common identifiable buildings and construction methods and materials of construction was present. We did not have the types of variations that we have today back in the day. Buildings behave, the rules of firefighting were pretty simple operation, tactics, direct engagement. We had a very prescriptive type of construction and also a very prescriptive construction-based tactics that still influences many jurisdictions across the United States. We have fire dynamics that matched fire suppression back at that time frame. The process models, the methods, the practices were present. They were institutionalized. They were pretty consistent. Whether we were in an urban setting or in a rural setting, what we were learning, what we were applying was pretty straightforward. And for the most part, what we were doing across the United States from East Coast to West, North and South was pretty common aside from some of the elements that were environmentally driven. When we talk about loading factors of snow or weather-induced conditions of hurricanes or tornadoes, or weather-related aspects of snow or rain or ice or other conditions, or seismic conditions. Those are the other things that certainly dramatically and dynamically change some elements when we talk about various areas across the United States and what's different. There are some buildings that by the sheer nature of their seismic integrity components that are built into that building or retrofitted, we have buildings that have a more robust degree of resiliency and integrity over time. Thus, they can take much more um, um, in, impact by fire, heat, smoke, the other conditions, building failures, compromise, the shifting of load capacities. The buildings have a much more robust capability of withstanding all of these attributes here to allow us to conduct operations. So without getting too far into the in-depth component of it, those are part of the aspects that are built into the structures by code and by some of the aspects of where these buildings are built. Time was not an issue. Buildings allowed us to do our job. Personnel knew and did their jobs. Proficiency, rigor, mission above all. Simple technology, manual brute force, physical exertion, determination. It was all about the job, right? We had time. We had people. We could mess up, still be alive. We could have errors and omissions. We could not know the job, still get away with it. We were slow to change. Change was discussed, debated, vetted, accepted, and then implemented. We embraced tradition while we were making it. Today's Fireground, again, the aspects of not only construction, but building anatomy. One of the things that we continue to advocate and include in our conversations, this goes well beyond just the fundamentals of the 5 building types. And it goes well beyond just building construction. We're talking about building anatomy and all the attributes that go into that. We talk about the elements of functionality and the integration of those into this 5 and 5. So again, I'm just reinforcing how this is going to come together. They influence our operations, our tactics, our degree of engagement. They have an influence on the civilian life safety. There is occupancy use and classification. There's also occupancy risk. Recognize that a vacant building is nothing more than an occupancy use classification, of which there may be varied levels of risk that are associated with it. Once we identify and comprehend and take a look at the other attributes there, we can identify the levels of either actual or perceived risks and then determine our incident action plan and go to work. Just because a building's occupancy use may suggest it's either known or suggested that may be vacant, which is a status usage to it, there's a lot of other correlations to it. And again, this is something that's been drawn out of some conversations and some things that we've been doing very robustly over the last number of years, dealing with vacant or abandoned buildings. We've gotten into some conversations here, although we won't get into a greater degree of conversation on this episode, but we've had conversations on some of our other webcasts and certainly in our stand-up programs and deliveries dealing with vacant, abandoned, derelict buildings, identifying levels of risk, identifying some of the risk factors relative to the engagement. Again, we've got to be smart, critical thinking, conservative bias to figure out what we're going to do, when we're going to do it, how we're going to do it, and the level of risk that's imposed upon companies that are operating. This goes back into the predictability performance, which are attributes that are learned, they're studied, they are correlated back to particular occupancy and building types, construction and building anatomy, era and vintage factors. So these are preloaded up front. We learn about them. We apply them to the front right seat at the company level. We learn and apply them through various elements of our built environment and our first due. Those differences that, again, may be unique to our particular first due or battalion or division or our city or community, however large or small, whether it be rural or all the way certainly up to the metro and urban capacity. These are things that once we identify what are the factors of predictability, they become our very astute and very defined roadmap that assists us in identifying, reading the building, and figuring those things out relative to size up and operations. It's looking at fire loads, rate of heat release, understanding the fire dynamics, understanding the variables relative to engineering, architectural construction, the methods and materials of construction that constantly are changing, and sometimes the cost factors that went into that particular building that directly correlate back into other risk factors of the building. We have to have a much more adaptive versus prescriptive perspective, and then the integration of process models, methods, and practices that work for your community. So again, there are some elements here that are very definable, that are going to be present in an urban or metro environment, in a first due, that are part of a first due of a battalion, of a division, or a borough or an entire city. But there's also some things here that are going to be part in a very specific standpoint for those defined risks that are part of a rural setting, either in the middle of nowhere or that four corners stop sign or single traffic light in the rural, the suburban, the urban suburban, the outer wildland areas, the coastal, the seaside areas, all the way up to our urban and metro conditions. Time compression, limitation factors, and the performance demands of our Fireground. Again, yesterday's Fireground to today's Fireground, we talk about those aspects. Again, this is not, and I repeat, this is not the Fireground or the fire service of the 80s, 90s, and certainly the early 2000s. And when we talk about some of those demands and relationships here, again, we talk about lessons and learnings and insights, the historical context, the bases. These all have an influence on our condition and tactical reflex, how we are conditioned, whether it be correct, faulted, or inaccurate. But again, it does cause us to have pause to take a look at how we've been trained, what we've been conditioned, what kind of buildings do I typically fight fires within, what have been their resiliency and integrity, how much time do I have had, is it unlimited, is it very narrow? How does that relate back into the methods and materials of construction? How does it relate back to our size up? Is it cursory? Do we just follow a couple of bullets and go through the motions? Is it pre-programmed based upon our SOPs? Is it pre-programmed based upon the expectations of the Fireground that we just do something, say something, and go to work as quickly as we can? Or are there meaningful and value-added insights that we are looking at beyond the cursory of a building? Yeah, it's a 2.5-story wood frame, but what about that 2.5-story wood frame? Are there additions? Are there add-ons? Is there something there that by age and deterioration or additions or alterations or exclusions that are going to be paramount and be mission critical to what I may be doing on that Fireground in the next 10 minutes? So we've got to take a look at those elements. Again, simply put, we've got to take a look at the career-long demands and efforts when we talk about the built environment, developing these levels of insight, and again, looking at the aspects of rethinking, defragging, rebooting, reprogramming, reformatting, expanding our critical thinking, and developing profound building literacy. Because again, you may not be able to outrun your degree of illiteracy. And I'll say this, the American Fire Service, and generally speaking, the North American Fire Service, is functionally illiterate. So think about that for a moment. Functionally illiterate. We know enough to get by, but not nearly enough at the intermediate or certainly at the advanced levels to really go beyond the fundamentals of understanding a particular occupancy type and identifying it, talking about the 5 fundamental building construction types that, again, just based upon experience over the last 39 years, and certainly of the last recent number of years, we have challenges out there with the fire service, both from the metro all the way to the rural settings, of the most common element of comprehension. And that is to understand when we talk about the 5 fundamental classes or typing of a building, just being able to identify what that 1 through 5 classification are, what they mean, how they affect Fireground reads and operations. You know, again, when we talk about this, guys, we are very short in terms of that level of competency. Again, so we are functionally illiterate, but we are certainly making efforts, and it's certainly not doom and gloom. We are doing better. But again, when we take a look at those lessons and learnings, I want to talk a little bit about connecting some dots here in our conversation, but those lessons and learnings that are, again, historical, things from the past, when we talk about the aspects of tradition, culture, legacy practices, the methods, and the sacrifices. These are all part of our legacy. Lessons from the Fireground, respecting the past, having a much more adaptive perspective, being combat ready, focused, trained, aligned, and skills are all about yesterday's Fireground, but they're also part of today's Fireground. We take a look at some of the historical repeating events, ineffective or lack of risk management, no pre-fire planning, faulted strategic triage. We talk about either classical decision-making or recognition prime or naturalistic decision-making, faulted tactics and operations, incident action plans, freelancing at a variety of different levels, the lack and timeliness of resources, too little, too late, or not even present, no proactive strategic level or tactical accountability, not understanding the time compression or disconnection, time continuum, disregarding or not having appreciation of tactical windows, command compression, derelict command incompetencies, tactical incompetencies, and the lack of tactical agility and mobility. And this goes on, lack of situational awareness, not understanding the building, the occupancy risk, the interface of companies, not understanding the buildings on fire, structural assemblies, and systems, just having the appreciation. So when we talk about lightweight engineered construction, and certainly if I had the ability to get an engagement and get some feedback, we would have a variety of different responses to what lightweight construction is or isn't. And more importantly, I'll just sort of put this out here for you guys to think about. When was it introduced into the fire service? When was it introduced into the built environment? When was it introduced in our buildings and occupancies and our architectural and engineering aspects of our buildings, both the residential and commercial buildings? Again, we have gone so far beyond the conversation of building anatomy, just talking about lightweight engineered components. We now have systems and other interfaces and hybrid structures that we need to identify or comprehend or sometimes predict and anticipate, that when we talk about that type of component or system or assembly, we should be referring to it in terms of the engineered structural systems. So again, it goes beyond some of the cursory things that have been very, very common, and actually go back all the way to 1959, 1960, when lightweight construction was first introduced into our built environment, and then became very much common in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and then fast forward. It is a major component when we talk about both commercial, multiple occupancies, and the continuing issues dealing with hybrid commercial structures, when even at best we are going to be difficult, we're going to have difficulties and challenges, and it may be somewhat impossible, but not impossible, to identify those reads once we get engaged into both the visual as well as the physical engagement of opening up the building to identify building features that will aid in the determination and the continuation of our incident action plan. Just recognize too here is that presumptive building reads that are done initially upon the arrival in that first few minutes of operations, as we gain further building intel and get engaged in the building, and again, the importance of interior size up and interior reads by company officers, or certainly divisional managers. When we talk about interior divisions and operations, we've got to be continually identifying, both from observation and engagement, those elements of the building that are going to be important, have to be communicated back to command, that are going to be insightful for determining the tactical windows, determining levels of risk, and more importantly, determining the span of time that we're going to be continue to be engaging and operating within definable areas, within certain areas of the compartment, the building floor areas, again, within the vertical and the horizontal, and then certainly the aspects around the fireground. Not understanding fire dynamics, overconfidence, indifference, egotism, rationalizations of risk, and so forth, insufficiency of fire suppression, and again, just looking at some of the other aspects here: span of control, tactical entertainment, organizational narcissism, lack of appreciation or understanding, again, the knowledge of building sciences, the integration of fire protection engineering, occupancy risk and hazards, treating many things the same, underestimating the risk or having no risk perception, dysfunctional timing that goes back into the tactical windows, no discipline, no rigor, past successes that are driving our operations and our decision making, rules of engagement, knowledge, skills, and ability, operational gaps, company command level, resistance to the need for change, embracing acquired insights and building intel. And again, the consequences certainly are profound. And when we take a look at some of those elements, again, they're right in front of us. If we are knowledgeable, if we are engaged, if we are a student of the job and continuing to add this insight and information and putting that all together through a variety of internal and external, anecdotal and empirical conditions, we become intoxicated by tradition, enamored by our culture and foster beliefs, passionate about the job, contentious towards safety and change. We romanticize the perils, the risk, and the adverse outcomes. It's part of the job. It's who we are. It's what we do, right? It's also the aspects of bravery, heroics, being valiant. It's what legends are made out of. but it's also fatalistic, gratuitous, and sometimes ignorant in that process. When we take a look at some corollaries, and as we step back here a moment, again, it's important to understand when we take a look at the historical perspective, and this is just, again, are just a couple of connect the dots here. When we take a look at the NIOSH top 5, and this, again, fluctuates somewhat. There's some really good things going on by a variety of different groups, both myself as well as many other colleagues within the fire service. One individual that I'll name and quote by name is Mike Richardson from the Fire Department Safety Officers Association, past NIOSH field investigator, currently doing some really great research and needs. He's tied into quite a bit of attributes dealing with situational awareness. But again, Mike's looking at some aspects dealing with familiarizing ourselves and looking at the data, the individual data points, and correlating that back into a different database to identify some things that, again, have been anecdotal or have been outdated at best, based upon past precedences and so forth. But again, Mike also has a little bit of a different take on the reads on the Fireground. I'll talk about my 4 reads that we introduced back in the early 2000s. We'll talk about our 4 reads. Mike has a little bit of a different take on that. He also has a little bit of a different take on the era and vintage and the introduction of some of the human performance aspects, of which the lack of accountability is part of that. So we'll talk a little bit about improper risk, lack of accountability, inadequate communications, lack of incident command or management, and the lack of following established SOPs and procedures. Those continue to be the attributes that really fall into why we're doing some things differently here relative to our first arriving construction tactics and safety. So we have to understand where we've come from, how they, again, influence what we're doing here today, to understand their importance in the big scheme of things. So it would be remiss of us of not talking about this thing or these attributes here as we lead into having an understanding of why there are 5 critical elements of a building, why there are 5 critical domains of a building's characteristics, and how they relate back to RIT, interior and exterior size up, resiliency, integrity, and time, and have a relationship toward predictability of performance and how they engage in our decision making. This is part of a bigger element here. But if we did not introduce and talk about these things and take advantage of that, then literally we are taking entire chapters out of our conversation, and that continuity of understanding the big picture would certainly be lost. And again, it's part of connecting the dots here. So when we take a look at the NFFF, 6 contributing domains coming out of the U.S. Fire Administration, again, these 6 areas include extraordinary events, ineffective decisions, ineffective policies, procedures, leadership, personal responsibility, and the lack of preparation. Again, the lack of preparation is going to be an important element here that takes us right down the center line path of building reads. The root cause analysis that was done through the University of Georgia in a study identified 4 correlating attributes, again, at a very distinctive root cause perspective. So when they take a look at the line of duty deaths, they take a look at the correlating NIOSH top 5, the NFFF 6 domains, they identified 6 related aspects. Under-resourcing, inadequate preparation for or anticipation of adverse events during operations. Again, that in itself is one of the most significant attributes of building reads. It's what we have identifiable that we are seeing upon our arrival. We are anticipating, we are projecting, we are forecasting. So it's not only what we are seeing upon arrival, but being able to predict and forecast in terms of preparation for these adverse events that have everything to do with what? The compartment and the building and our personnel. So again, when we take a look at the other 2, incomplete adoption of IC procedures, policies, and protocols, and then suboptimal personal company readiness. When we put those together, these are the 4 attributes here, but I'll show you the matrix. So this matrix is sort of our crosswalk of those 3 distinctive areas. You can see the correlation on how they play out. But again, there is both the vertical and the horizontal connections, but they ultimately lead into this stratification that we're showing here. Again, ICS, management, adoption, procedures, policies, SOPs, failure to follow, resources, risk, preparation. The most critically here, as I mentioned, inadequate preparation for anticipation of the adverse events. It's all about reading the fire, reading the building, reading the fireground. Ineffective decisions, leadership, personnel readiness, again, all the KSAs, and then the extraordinary events, and yes, the inadequacies of communications that can be binned out. And this is where we go. So when we talk about this as it relates to reading the building and fireground risk, it has everything to do with the inadequate preparation for or the anticipation of adverse events during operations at the company, at the command, and at the task levels, dealing with the building, the compartment, and the company, and our introduction of the four critical reads of the fireground. So it is reading the fireground. It is reading the building. It is reading the compartment and or fire and or smoke. And it's also the aspects of reading the company. So again, we wanted to introduce this aspect because there are four distinctive reads, and there are again some slight takes that others may have that typically expand upon this. But again, these are part of our formality and part of our building facts modeling, and also part of our predictability performance that are integrated throughout this model. So you may see some differences, you may see some other attributes, but again, there are also sometimes some different spins that come about that may not be legitimate. And I'll just say this is that there are some different takes out there through a variety of our other colleagues that may not be nothing more than a spin. And unless there is a valid connection, an attribute, then one can discuss and defend and have the ability to correlate of how this is connected and what is the actuality and the reality and the empirical connections or the experience-based connections that have these terminologies and attributes come together. Then sometimes the other things that are being discussed are spin and maybe much more anecdotal than something that can be expressed based upon experience, anecdotal elements there, and correlated back into some of our models. Let me bypass this. Again, the connection of what we do in the firehouse does have an imprint on the fireground. And again, don't be oblivious or ignorant or naive that one doesn't affect the other. And I don't want to get into the details of this, but I just always talk about what we do in the firehouse directly relates back to the fireground. And again, there's quite a bit of challenges and gaps, and there's certainly a lot of areas for improvement. These lessons and learnings, they all come together when we talk about both yesterday's fireground and how do we apply them to today's fireground. And that's part of our conversation here. Those traits and attributes, those things that become, or excuse me, the conditions that occur in the firehouse, again, may very well become traits, characteristics, principles, the personas, and also may become part of the biases, the values, the position statements and conditions that end up occurring on the fireground. If you are not reading and comprehending and having an understanding of the lessons and learnings that are drawn out of both recent and historical past NIOSH reports, all I can say is, what is it that you're doing and why aren't you doing it? I could certainly be much more dismissive, but again, if you are at the company and if you certainly are at the command level, you better have read certainly the line of duty deaths, the near misses, the close calls that are related to your state, maybe to your region, and then expand upon that relative to the conditions that occur in other jurisdictions across the United States in different timeframes, again, in different years, and identify those elements that are going to potentially be present in the types of buildings, occupancies, and risk. The challenges are this: it's just no longer just a single family residence. Again, it has gone from something very simplified to something more complex. It's gone from that to this, right? And again, these are some of the challenges. When we take a look at, again, the footprint of a building, we take a look at compartmentation, something that's pretty simplified, pretty direct and forward, to something that has become more complex. But again, have we adapted our game plan, our template? Do we have an understanding of how that plays out relative to our Fireground blueprint, our building anatomy, and also our building reads? Just a quick couple of items. This is taken out of our mega mansion class that we do on mega mansions and large area residentials, but even just the evolutions of the simple world of our buildings. 980 square feet back in the 50s, all the way to the common square footage and the footprint of a residential of 3,200 square feet. And many of you may have certainly much sizable residential structures. And again, just to give you some correlation, if we can classify, if we can identify the predictability based upon the anatomy of the building and other attributes that are part of the design, the construction, and the kind of regional characteristics and conditions that may be present across the U.S., guess what? We can also develop the tactical template. We can identify the footprint, and then again, develop efficiencies in our building reads, identifying those conditions that are going to give us more efficiency on the Fireground. So again, single family residence, the common ranges of 4 to 6, the upper ranges of 7 to 9. We can also tie that into what's called mini mansions. The McMansions primarily are within the criteria of the era of the 1980s when they were first introduced, and they were common to the 3,000 square foot footprint. Today, we talk typically, again, around the United States, there may be some differences, and there are some very regional-based attributes of around 4 to 8. Large area residentials may be commonly between 4 and 10. The mini mansion from 4 to 8,000 square feet that are very regionally based. And again, the mansion in its truest sense, based upon the federal estate taxation code, is between 11 and 25,000 square feet. And then we've introduced this concept of the mega mansions. Again, the attributes that are found between 25 and 50, the giga mansions between 50 and 75. And yes, there are tetra mansions and greater around the United States are 75 to 100,000 square feet. So again, let's get into the specifics here. If you're going to command or tactically engage a structural fire, you better understand the building. There's a limited margin for error on today's evolving Fireground, and errors and omissions are unforgiving. Stretching and operating in a building that you have no knowledge or insights of or consideration for is derelict, placing you and your company at risk. And it's more than just stretching the line and going in. It's about the building, the compartment, the company, this aspect of RIT that we've introduced. It's the introduction and integration of the first arriving construction, tactics, and safety, and having a much greater appreciation and respect for the elapse of time as it relates to the building. We have to develop both building and fire literacy that we've introduced. And again, we have to have an appreciation and understanding of the building facts, integration and comprehension, and also the ability to be able to apply this to the Fireground in a variety of different applications. And it goes without saying that building construction is as fundamental to structural firefighting as water is to fire suppression. And stand by here. We've got a little bit of a technical issue. So let's see what happens here. Okay, we're back up. All righty. All right, stand by here. We got a little bit of a technical problem. All right, we'll hope for the best here. So I'm not quite sure what glitch we had. Let's get the program back up.
Don't rush. Take your time, catch your breath. You need to
I
take.
am. I'm trying to. I appreciate that, Ed. Thanks, Chief, very much on that. So, yeah, I'm not sure what ended up occurring, whether there was a little bit of a spike or something, but it was interesting to see what happens here. So, all right, let me just sort of reboot ourselves here, and hopefully we're in the right program, to say the least. Again, so let's get to this. So let me take a quick slug of coffee here, and I'll have everybody do the same here for a quick moment. Screen's back up. Audio's still good, everybody, on that end, correct, Ed?
Yeah, you're good. You're
Okay, very
slides
good.
are back up your audio.
I see the thumb. All right, it's very good. So again, the question is, how do I know what I don't know if I don't know it, right? And that's both at the company officer and the command level. We've got to be engaged. We've got to be looking at our buildings. Again, I stress the importance of getting out in the field. It's both the book knowledge, it's the understanding of what we see on the job. It's also the comprehension of understanding how buildings are constructed. Nothing can take the place out of taking field trips, either individually or with your companies or with your units out into the job sites, both officially and unofficially, going out there while they're being constructed, having an official tour with in conjunction with the site superintendents or foremans, the job supervisors. It's also the stuff that you do on your own. Sometimes the best opportunities to see what's going on our off hours on weekends when the job site is left in its sort of a pristine, sterile standpoint before things are covered over or before they are sort of pushing you and guiding you on a tour, not to see something here or there. You will truly be able to comprehend and understand some of the things that are going on in that building regarding construction deficiencies, workmanship, and so forth. Our good friends in Framingham, Massachusetts, again, tremendous good leadership, taking our companies out there. Again, we've worked and collectively have seen some of the results of building knowledge and literacy by, again, engaging in that type of environment and putting that all together. Understanding intimately the built environment, the fire phenomena, integrating the elements, having technically accurate information, pre-fire planning. But again, it's at all stages, guys. It's understanding as the foundation and the construction sites are being built all the way up through the various construction stages and inclusive of occupancy throughout the lifespan of the buildings. All buildings are predictable if we have a model and understand the performance indicators that we are now introducing you to here in this particular program. All buildings, again, have a definable insight and focus when we talk about performance indicators. It's an understanding of the building's anatomy, understanding, again, if we're looking at the structure and I ask the question, give me a type, tell me what the building type is. Hopefully many of you are sort of going back and forth between a building of type 3, brick and joist, or ordinary construction, or a building of type 4 construction. So if I was also to say that there's a new type 4 construction today that is part of the International Building Code, the International Fire Code, that identifies a modern type of type 4 that doesn't represent or look anything like our older legacy type of type 4 construction that deals with cross-laminate timber or mass timber. You may be scratching your head and saying, no, I don't believe it. But yeah, there's an entirely different type of type 4 construction that now is introduced that also leads to a hybrid type of structure. So again, we go beyond the fundamentals of the 5 building types, understanding the building's anatomy, understanding and being able to look at a building and understand how it's constructed as this image is depicting, and being able to look at the building in this type of condition to understand that this is what's behind it. Understanding the anatomy, the construction, the materials, the methods and materials of construction, and then also relate that back to how is this building being affected by the fire dynamics that are either identifiable on arrival, that are showing upon our reads and size ups, or the things that we discover that may be deep-seated based upon the footprint of the building, or maybe within one of the critical aspects of the building, within the concealed spaces or voids of the structure. So remember that part, because again, that particular element, concealed spaces and void, is a critical functional domain in the building. We have building conditions that are seasonal. Again, we've got to be able to look at them during the variety of seasons that may be present throughout your jurisdictions, however long or short, in good or in bad or inclement weather, and certainly the aspects between daytime operations and our building reads that are going to be very much present. So this is the obvious stuff, the things that we're going to see sometimes without really looking. So although we are looking, are we comprehending? And that becomes much more challenging when we talk about the conditions between daytime operations and nighttime operations, and also include the other challenges dealing with smoke conditions and other obscurity, other environmental factors that may be causing more challenges regarding how can I identify the critical elements of that building. Sometimes some things are going to be obvious, and sometimes the things that are obvious in the daytime conditions may be very much obscured or non-identifiable. Therefore, one has to have the ability to look at a building and identify characteristics of that building's anatomy and other related conditions of that structure that are part of that 5 critical pieces here to be able to forecast, predict based upon what we know, what we predict of that building, what our assumptions are, and hopefully the assumptions that we are making are being validated by the interior size up by companies and personnel at the command or company level that are also feeding building intel. So if I was to enter, let's say the larger, let me go back here a moment. If I was to make entry in the larger 5-story type 4 building that we see here at the corner that has the antique sign on it, Again, if I'm looking at that structure, both in terms of the width and the depth, the presence of these pilasters that we see, these vertical columns that actually are creating base to the building. I look at the first floor, I look at the size of the building. There are some things here that are screaming out at me that tell me that, again, it's very likely with a high degree of probability. I'm dealing with a multiple bay, 3-bay system. The width and depth are going to be pretty common to our particular area. I have a cornice condition. I have some other more modern attributes up above. I have some conditions that are obvious based upon floor areas that are occupied, other floor areas that may be in different stages of use. I have inaccessibility conditions. There's a whole variety of factors, but also more importantly, the materials and components of the building, the components that are brick unit conditions. It's a brick and joist and framed type building with heavy timber, but the smallest component of that building is the brick that becomes part of a wall assembly that becomes part of the building's perimeter functional areas. So these are some things here, guys, that we start building upon, that once you have sort of this roadmap that we're going to be getting into here, this becomes part of the intermediate to the advanced level conversations that, again, go beyond the obvious. We've got to have the ability to, again, being able to integrate all of this in the time compression at the command level. When we're trying to get into an engaged condition, we're trying to do the 360, we're trying to determine go and no-go criteria. Sometimes we abandon all of this. We give a quick size up on the building. It's a building type, occupancy, construction, what's showing, what's obvious, what may not be obvious, and we go to work. The other part of that is, do we have the latitude of time on the first arriving to truly conduct an appropriate compressed time, size up, do the 360, and then continue to do that when we're engaged in a tactical task level operation to feed information, sometimes conditions that are obscured. But again, just entering that building, let me go back one here again. One of the things that's going to be critical here is that by entering the threshold of that front door or other access door, it's not always entering the front of the building or entering some side, but certainly entering that structure. If I was to find an open 2-story section of that building when I'm expecting to find, let's say, a 15-foot ceiling somewhere above the transom area of that front facade of that structure, if I see the interior of that building has been modified or changed, that is a critical interior read that has to be communicated back to command, because we're not going to have the same predictability of performance. I can go into a commercial or mixed use occupancy, an entertainment or a restaurant or some type of a common adaptive reutilized building of type 3 or 4 construction, as we see here. I can have the interior completely gutted out with new engineered structural systems. That is an important interior read to communicate back to command, because although we may have an outside that looks like it's an older building, possibly built in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and again, correlating that aspects of building read, predictability, and operations, the interior is giving us an entire different read. Sometimes we've got to open up the floor. Sometimes we've got to get into the ceiling area. Sometimes we've got to get into the maintenance rooms to be able to identify those things. Sometimes we open up the exterior of the structure. We've got to take invasive reads or invasive activities to figure out what it is, what it's not, what we're assuming, and more importantly, trying to hone that back down to what is it with a high degree of probability that now influences our decision making, influences our tactical windows, and gives us the ability to operate for a designated period of time before something bad happens, either in the environmental compartments by flame, heat, or smoke, or other aspects dealing with flame impingement, burn through, or expansion or structural loads and other factors. So again, the influence of construction on Fireground decision making and operations is inherently fundamental. It may be diminished, it may be neglected, it may be misunderstood, and sometimes misapplied erroneously, which again gets us into this functional illiteracy. We've got to be able to look at today's Fireground and directly align to the 3 integrated domains. We talk about the building of the compartment and company. And again, neglecting any single or more will diminish Fireground capabilities and also potentially diminish a positive outcome based upon the elapse of time of what's happening onto the building. These all, again, come together when we talk about the first arriving. They directly correlate with all of the facets of today's Fireground with this level of appreciation of the elapsed time. And again, when Fireground performance indicators and reads, when applied accurately and timely based upon the elapse of time, and are defined within the high probability, and when defined with a high probability of tactical deployments and operations. They will give us a more positive outcome. Fireground assessments and size up is a continuous fluid process, again, at varied strategic and tactical levels, both on the fireground and within the building. Thus, the importance of, again, the outside or exterior size up the building reads, and the importance of what is not adequately discussed or discussed at all when we talk about correlating and now implementing a interior read, which is difficult at best at the company task level, but nonetheless sometimes important information at best when it is identified or assumed based upon, again, knowing and comprehending what we're seeing and putting that together. And that becomes part of the challenge. Do we comprehend what we see? And again, it's part of that built environment and fireground challenges. Structural fireground operations, one of the most important aspects of looking at the building is identifying potential of the building relative to collapse and compromise, which has a direct influence on operational safety and operations all in all. Again, it has everything to do with the built environment and the building occupancy performance. We're introducing this concept of the first arriving. We're sort of building upon this concept, of which there are a number of sub-attributes that we are not going to have the time to discuss. But again, it's talking about building construction and structural considerations. It's the fire dynamics and how they play out with the predictability of building performance, which are learned attributes of which none of our current textbooks, nor are they discussed in fire dynamics, nor are they discussed in building construction elements. This is an evolving attribute that we are correlating, introducing, and integrating, and have been doing so for well over, certainly very diligently over the last 15 years, but have been continuously introducing this into the opportunities that are presented to us through our training and presentations. There are both strategic and tactical considerations that come out of that. And again, when we talk about the variations of residencies, residential, the commercial fireground, multiple occupancies, the challenges of operations, and the continuing evolving challenges of fire dynamics in a variety of both simple and complex buildings that are creating very, very dynamic fireground conditions in which we have sometimes no clear definable go and no go, but we have these gray areas that now really become part of our size up, part of our reads, part of our assumptions, the accuracy of what we are assuming, and constantly trying to validate as we go into the operations in a variety of building types, occupancy types, age and vintage, and correlate that back into the human performance element of the adequacies of our companies. Am I responding with a one or two person staffed company? Dramatically different than going out the door with a 3 or 4 or 5 person staff company. But at the same time, I could have a 5 person staff company, but the experience level and capabilities and knowledge may be diminished. It may not be across the board as a constant, which may play out in terms of what we do on the fireground. And sometimes, yeah, we do have go and no go considerations, but we have to identify that. Do we have various types of operational creep where personnel are operating within collapse zones or other conditions that sometimes are defined by the lack of discipline and rigor that may be present on the fireground and within the operational modes of oversight. But the aspects of building risk, fire risk, occupancy type, and occupancy risk are really formative as part of our operation. I'll just take a moment here to give you a little bit of insights in that 1932 Fire Chief's Handbook that was published. This was the first textbook written specifically for the fire service. Again, it was published in 1932, and they talk about, again, the fire service as referred to, a fire service profession as referred to frequently in recent years. Again, this is 1932, and in the broad sense of the term, as practiced by the well-trained modern fire department, it may be so classified. So again, they talk about the modern aspects. They talk about a number of different attributes. And even in 1932, they first talked about the aspects of size up. They talked about safety or life safety. They talked about the first line going interior, and by interior means, and there's again a whole variety of attributes that are written and developed right out of this particular textbook. Again, size up, quick survey of the situation as encountered by the fire department upon arrival, They identified life hazard, property hazard, but they also identified the importance of an initial action plan based upon the first arriving officer, rest the heaviest responsibilities, and they also started talking about type of construction, the development of fire within each type of construction, that there are very specific types of characteristics, sizing up the building's height, characteristics of construction, very important aspect of opening, exposure conditions, and guess what? If you look at this bulletized item, they also talked about wind-related conditions in 1932. So it wasn't the fact that NIST and UL suddenly introduced that in the most current context. They were talking about wind-driven considerations back in 1932. And then again, they also talked about the aspects of interior firefighting, smallest area, and they also talked about ventilation. And they actually said, and the term was coined, opening up the building, was promoted in that textbook, but was considered a poor practice by best practices in the United States at the time. This all goes back into, again, developing analytical perspectives, having proficiency, knowledge, resiliency, aggressiveness, discipline, being adaptive, and having grit. Primary decision making also looks at the integrity, the proximity, our accessibility. What is the severity of the incident and the fire condition? What is the building's habitability? How can we habitate? How can we access and operate within the building? So when we talk about the primary decision makings on the building read, it is all about the integrity of the structure or the lack of integrity, our ability and what is our degree of proximity in, around, on top, next to, or interior of the structure. It's the accessibility and actually accessing and being able to go into the building in a variety of different areas. It's the habitability of the compartment, of the floor, of the building. When we talk about the aspects of the definable occupancy hazards of the environment, it's also specific to the fire dynamics and the ensuing fire conditions that are there, both thermal and non-thermal, the flame and heat impingement. It's all about our ability to have survivability while we conduct mission critical tasks, whatever they may be, and for what duration of time. We talk about this 10-minute tactical window. What happens when we have a particular building or occupancy type? Excuse me for a moment. What happens when we have a building or occupancy type that gives us the ability to maintain habitability in a environmentally stressed environment, but by virtue of the building's writ, again, how does that play out with duration of time? And at what point in time do we have compromise? Do we have collapse of the compartment, of the floor, of the building? And how does that relate back to capability? So when we pull those elements together, they have a direct influence on our decision making, which ultimately is all drawn out of the sizing up and looking at the reads and looking at the risks of the building when we relate that back into our Fireground operations, both at the command and at the company task level. The modern Fireground has some specifics when we talk about influencers. And again, the specifics deal with three areas that we first introduced at the beginning, right? It's all about the building integrity relative to compromise and collapse based upon the elapse of time. It is the fire severity based upon the megawatts of energy. We talk about the fire load package, the fire intensity, the fire severity relative to the elapse of time or the aspects of delta time. It's also the company level performance based upon the human performance aspects over the elapse of time. So those first two variables include company integrity, accountability, expectations, performance, rigor, and fortitude. And they evolve into the challenges when we talk about the four reads: reading the Fireground, the building's footprint, the size, the volume, the complexity, the numbers of structures, the exposures, the topographical conditions. Do I have change in topography from front to rear or rear to side? Do I have vegetation? Do I have other factors that are going to either assist or become challenges that may impede my operation? So there is a number of attributes that are drawn out of the aspects of reading the Fireground that one would expand upon here. Reading the building, we're going to talk about the 5-on-5 here in a moment. Again, those are going to be self-revealing. There's also, again, some aspects of reading the compartment that now hone in on the aspects of the either the largeness or smallness of that compartment, the spans that may be present, the structural integrity of the floor systems and ceiling systems, the integrity of the compartment. And when we start thinking about integrity of building and compartment, the easy connection here relates back to fire codes. and we talk about the ratings. And typically those are in minutes or hours of duration based upon what? Heat and flame exposure. So this ties directly back into some of the things that are very much apparent and readily attributed toward the design and construction of various buildings and occupancies that have occupancy risk based upon their functionality, based upon the materials, and based upon the ability to withstand the effects of flame, heat, and fire impingement to allow us to habitate and operate in, around, on top, next to, or underneath the building. Those are the missing pieces that are out there. We do not correlate those things enough. We go on a fire floor. We understand what may be evident in terms of auto extension. We've got fire extending from a compartment to another compartment, auto extension. We get fire into concealed spaces, both internal or external. They're introduced in a variety of conditions, but yet we just focus in on the attributes of fire suppression or the other activities. We have other functional tasks that are being encountered. We have personnel that are conducting primary searches. We have other support activities in terms of opening up the structure, forcing doors, conducting a variety of these other elements. But when we talk about suppression, search and rescue, and the correlating aspects of tactical support, we are functioning in these floor or compartment areas that have to be considered relative to their integrity. Why is it that we have these unexpected floor and or ceiling collapses, roofs coming down, walls giving way, internal, external collapses? Again, these are all very predictable, and that goes back to the problem that we have of why we have, as one of the 4 root causes out there, the inability for commanders or company officers to identify the adverse conditions before they happen and be able to react upon them in a proactive manner. We are very, very good at Mayday, Mayday. I got a structural collapse, Mayday, Mayday. I got firefighter down. I've got a flashover, I've got a collapse, whatever it may be. And we are in a reactionary manner. What we've got to get better on is implementing these reads in a proactive manner from the first arriving and through the continuum of our operations until some things are under control, but not stopping, because we still may have challenges regarding the predictability of performance in a building that has now been affected by flame, heat, the loss of structural integrity, the transmission of loads that now change the balance of integrity of the building. These all have been rooted out and have been shown in the past to have been contributors toward overhauling the building, and suddenly we've got 6 or 9 firefighters that end up falling through a floor that gives way while they're overhauling the structure. Well, no one's looking at the global picture of structural integrity that now becomes part of reading the compartment, reading the building, reading the Fireground. So again, these are the 4 critical elements. The challenge for today's incident commanders and operating companies on the modern Fireground is to clearly recognize building performance factors and inherent construction characteristics, or those conditions that have been modified. That's sort of a caveat to this, that can result in compromise and collapse. Again, command officers, assigned personnel, depending upon roles and responsibilities, sometimes cannot comprehend the relevancy of observations or communications, or cannot observe or see mission critical conditions or performance indicators relative to the challenges of smoke, weather, darkness, concealment, obstruction, design, or proximity or location. So sometimes, again, we have both mental and physical obscurity. We sometimes don't understand what the communication is when someone is telling us something, and we just don't understand because we don't have that degree of literacy. So that becomes part of the challenge. Predicting adverse fire behavior and potential structural compromise or collapse is one of the most challenging tasks facing first-due companies and commanders at a fire. Usually the lack of information on the construction of the building, the fire size, the fire location, fire burn time, conditions of the building, the fuel load, etc., makes the task sometimes nearly impossible. However, when key building considerations and fireground indicators, when presented, when recognized, when identified for their relevancy and importance to the operation, importance to operational safety, can dramatically influence operational outcomes. So it's not always impossible, but again, we've got to develop these both empirical insights relative to the occupancies, integrate that into our combat structural engagement plans and the relationship to construction, occupancy, performance, materials, systems, and time. Another major takeaway here. This is something that, again, leads us into this integrated perspective of first arriving construction, tactics, and safety, and more importantly, that leads back into our reads. All right, let me take a moment here. Ed, how are we doing on time? We good to continue on for maybe another half hour?
We can get another 10 or 15 minutes, Chris.
Okay, so I'll give it another 10 or 15 minutes. I understand. So, all right, with that being said, let me fast forward to some of the key takeaways. So when we talk about predictability and we talk about building reads, and again, the comprehension, the understanding, the application. If I show this particular image in Fireground operations on the East Coast, again, I'm going to get a certain perspective. If I show it on the West Coast, of which this is a depiction of Fireground ops in a building of bowstring construction, oh my God, the world is ending. And again, we're having some heartache, and some keyboard warriors are having a fit about what are they doing on the roof. But again, there are predictabilities based upon attributes of the building, the reads, the functionality, the structural elements here, and more importantly, where are they located. So a lot of what's drawn out of risk is going to be based upon where and how these buildings are built in your jurisdiction around the various areas of the United States. So yes, we can perform certain functions in certain locales if we have an appreciation and understanding of the building's anatomy, the aspects of the occupancy, the collapse and compromise characteristics, the methods and the materials of construction, and yes, the fire dynamics that allow us to have conditions that are mitigated, under control, and are able to be savable property and hopefully savable lives based upon the inherent fireground conditions. It all has to do with construction, vintage, and era. It's understanding the fire, the compartment, and those levels of resources. When we correlate that back into the operational aspects of our reads, now we go back into the functional area of the 5. So this is the important aspects here that ties into Fireground reads. It's trying to identify the building's anatomy or structural systems, identifying inherent collapse and compromise characteristics. It's looking at the occupancy type, occupancy risk, and other subset characteristics. It is the identifiable methods and materials of construction that are part of the construction era and vintage of the building, going back up to the first bullet. And then it's also the fire dynamics that are inherently characteristics of, that are learned and sometimes assumed in buildings that we may not have experience level in, but those 5 fundamental areas have everything to do with building reads on today's Fireground. And this is something that ties back into our BEAR acronym of building, era and vintage, structural anatomy, and the levels of corresponding risk. These are the influencing factors that are part of our FACTS model. So showing and getting into the specifics of the building read, let me fast forward here to this. So here's the 5 and 5 that are critical to our size up in our modeling. So the building domain reads are relative to identification of, again, structural anatomy, era, and vintage of the building, of which there are some subsets. Occupancy type and occupancy risk, collapse and compromise characteristics. Sometimes they're negligible, or they may be very, very significant based upon what? The building's anatomy and occupancy type and risk. It's the methods of materials of construction that are either identified or are part of the understanding of the predictability of building performance that are learned, that are assumed, and sometimes predicted and or validated in our operation. And then it's the correlation of fire dynamics within that particular compartment and or structure. The 5 functional areas that one looks at are pretty straightforward. It is the roofing systems. It is the building's perimeter walls. It is the floor and or ceiling systems in multiple floor structures or occupancies. It is the compartment characteristics, and those are defined by the size, the square footage, the volume, the numbers of compartments, their relationship relative to other aspects within the building. But again, it's identifying and correlating compartment characteristics that are part of the RIT. And again, the last part that I made mention earlier on, it's the identification and appreciation of concealed spaces and voids. Those 5 and 5 are the most critical fundamentals that are part of our FACTS model that lead into the development of the refinement of building reads in certain occupancies. So now we could take this 5 and 5 and talk about their applications in the modern residential structure that were built from the 1980s to the 2000s, or the residential structures that are built from the 2000 era here to 2026. There's very distinctive lightweight engineered or engineered structural systems that were present in the 80s and 90s that are somewhat different that are present in the 2000 era here in the last 26 years. So these all fundamentally end up being drawn out of the type of structure relative to when it was built, the occupancy type and risk, and that are drawn out to this 5 and 5. So graphically, this is what the representation looks like, of which there are some subsets and bullets that we would get into a little bit more in detail. And then the contributors there, when we talk about those domains, we get back into, again, the enclosures of the perimeter walls, the roof, floor assemblies, the compartment, and also the voids and concealed spaces of that structure. These all come together when we start looking at era and vintage. Again, our era and vintage is very definable. These correlate back specifically to how buildings were designed and constructed in these various eras of time. We have the modern era from the 1980s to the 2000s, and the 2000s to 2026, the 50s to the 80s, the 1900s to the 1950s, the 1850s to 1900s, the 1800s to the 1850s, and all the way back to the 1700s to the 1800s. So there's some very definable considerations on our buildings of type 3 construction or residential occupancies in the 1800 period. The Civil War era gave us very definable characteristics that changed dramatically in the 1850s, 1860s that are very identifiable, that correlate back to building performance, that are identifiable on size up that one learns and then thus applies. So we have both what we call old heritage and new heritage construction. Our legacy construction is the period between 1900 and 1950. This goes against what UL refers to when they talk about, again, the legacy period. It's primarily from the 1980s going backwards, but again, there is such a vast level of insights that are drawn out of vintage and era related to the building characteristics, predictability, that are learned that we are not talking anywhere nearly enough when we talk about sizing up our buildings in these different eras and periods of time. These all fundamentally go together when we talk about looking at our buildings, identifying size up considerations and factors, putting that together relative to Fireground operations and conditions, and having that available within the dynamics of our fire situations that we're encountering in a whole variety of building and occupancy types. There are significant challenges that all go back to the training. I think it's safe to say that there is a very dominant challenge when we talk about building and fire literacy. We typically have sound bites of information that one gathers, and I would certainly venture to say that many of you are somewhat challenged even as we talk about these particular aspects here. It goes beyond the fundamentals of type 1 through 5. It goes beyond the basics of an occupancy type. We can talk about residential occupancies that are 4,000 square foot or 6,000 square foot built in the 1940s that have an entirely different occupancy risk and characteristics and sizing up when we talk about a 4,000 or 6,000 square foot residential building built in the 1990s or the early 2000s. So there are a lot of different elements there that one would get into that we would have discussions on and correlate that back into. Two other important slides I want to show you here before we get into the Q&A section. One of the aspects regarding a simplified approach on size up, when we take a look at life safety, it's specific to our occupants. We talk about severity, urgency, and growth of the fire incident or conditions that are present. It should lead us much more to an adaptive Fireground action or model. Fireground indicators are predominantly associated with our operations. They too are influenced by severity, urgency, and growth. They are more importantly influenced by the elapse of time that suggests an adaptive approach of operation. The building's predictability performance also has specific risks that are era and construction driven. Those all are highly influenced by the elapse of time that also suggest a more adaptive approach based upon size up indicators. Again, size up indicators, the methods and materials of construction that are present that again result in decisive actions, the elapse of time, having an orientation, understanding human performance, critical thinking, conservative bias, having a dynamic posturing, having a predictive plan at least 2 deep. So in other words, we need to be thinking about our operations for that 10-minute window, but what about the next 15 to 20, the next 20 to 25? So again, if we encounter an unexpected condition, such as a fire behavioral related challenge or a building compromise or integrity factor, we've got to have plans in place that are predictive and are ready to be implemented based upon the resulting conditions. The other remaining aspect here when we talk about fire dynamics in terms of the 10-minute window, I'll just show you a quick graphic here. That 10-minute window revolves around, again, arrival time. We typically have a operational period of around 6 to 8 minutes of engagement. There may be some imposing factors. There's some reflex time to get from curbside into the building. How much square footage can we cover by our companies based upon the availability of resources? How much gallon per minute flow rate if we have an encountering fire? We're looking at imposing factors. We're assessing, looking at severity, urgency, and growth. We're looking at risk, and command primarily is imposing upon that 10-minute give or take window. It's a benchmark to determine what the next 5 minutes of operational period may give us. So there's a lot more that we can discuss. We've actually talked about this rather extensively on some of our postings, where we got into some details that go well beyond the 20-minute window that some departments still utilize, and other departments have no Fireground performance indicator, 10 minutes or less, 20 minutes or greater. The benchmark and the performance indicator is fire under control or fire out. And hopefully the building and the occupancy has allowed us to function and perform in that capacity. And then lastly, I will just show you the correlation of some of these aspects when we get into some risk factors. Some of you may have some go or no go criteria, but based upon some of our modeling, and again, it's somewhat based upon the square footage and building sizes. But if I have a building that has 25% or less fire engagement, and I'm utilizing the 10-minute window as my benchmark, and assuming that we have 10 minutes of operational time, and that fire is not controlled, and I'm assuming that I'm losing another 25% or so of building integrity, I still have, again, potentially upwards of 75% of building integrity available. I have maybe lost an additional 25, but I still have maybe 50%. So that primarily gives us the ability to operate at risk, but more of a green go consideration based upon risk, based upon severity, and some other operational factors. If I have 50% or greater involvement of compartment, floor, and or building, based upon some characteristics of building, occupancy, era, vintage, and what have you, if I have a 10-minute window and I potentially lose another 25% of that building's integrity, either by assumption, prediction, or actuality, I now have less than 25% of building integrity or RIT available in that 10-minute window that now places operating companies at a very, very high level of risk with a high likelihood of compromise or catastrophic collapse. So some quick little insights that provide some perspective on that, which gets into some other aspects of RIT that we just did not have a chance to get into. But there are some conditions that go well beyond what Brunacini gave us back in the early 1980s about RIT. This is actually drawn out of some insights out of the NIOSH F 2012-13 report from a double line of duty death in Philadelphia. So some different elements and attributes here. All of these come together that really challenges our operations. When we take a look at all of those elements, we've got to maintain that vision to go forward. We've got to take a look at the risks associated with our buildings on today's Fireground. In your first due, it may not be some things that we are talking about here. It may be the mega mansions. It may be the old residential construction. It may be the multiple occupancies and townhouses. It may be, again, a variety of new construction or old construction. It may be derelict, abandoned buildings. It may be everything in between, new and old. For many of us, we are experiencing challenges that we've never seen before due to the continuing introduction of new methods and materials of construction, new building types. The biggest challenge we have out there is the hybrid constructed buildings that may have a dominant construction of methods and materials, but may act like a different type of building. They may look differently, which becomes part of the challenge. But again, now it becomes the importance of looking at outside and interior to put these things together. As you can see, there's a lot of moving parts. If nothing else, take away some insights relative to the RIT concept of building, the introductory concepts of building facts and how the first arriving, the construction influences, the tactics that influences safety and risks of our operations. understanding the 5 and 5. If nothing else, start looking at a particular occupancy relative to the building's anatomy and construction considerations, the era and vintage, the occupancy type and risks, the collapse and compromise characteristics, the methods and materials that are directly related back to era, vintage, and construction, and then the fire dynamics of that particular structure. Those are fundamental, that are part of the reads. They are fundamental to the study of the building. They are fundamental to the influence of operations in the fireground. And then inclusive of that is, again, is the functionality of roof, perimeter walls, floor under ceilings, the compartment, and the absence or presence and the characteristics of voids within that particular structure. So again, we've got to put a lot of things together. I sincerely hope that you've gotten some insights out of the brief period of time here that we've spent. Again, we'll have some insights that will be sent out to everybody through the emails. Please reach out to me for those of you that would like to gain some further insights. I will be at FDIC here in a couple of weeks. If you're at FDIC, look me up. We'll have a little bit more of an introductory program here talking about the influence of building construction and fire dynamics. I think that there will be some postings online of some of our other presentations around the country, both in April, May, and June. We're going to be doing some building reads. We're going to be at a couple of fire schools around the United States here, and we've got a number of online programs that we're going to be presenting here as we move forward. So we do appreciate that level of insight. Have you stop in, communicate. Chief, thank you so very much for the brief time frame. And for those of you that were lost in the weeds, try to catch up, because it's all about understanding that built environment and putting some things here together.
So before we go to take questions or look at the comments, any final thoughts or words of wisdom for our listeners?
The words of wisdom are, you've got to understand the built environment. If you are fighting fires in today's fireground, you better understand the building, because there's limited margin for error to make errors and omissions in the fireground. We're going to get killed. You're going to get injured. Some things aren't going to go right, and they can happen in an instant of an eye within the time duration. So become a student of the job, understand your buildings. That's going to keep you safe, and that's going to give you a good edge on the fireground.
Okay, so we'll go down through some of the comments in the chat. A long-time listener and ours from Erie, PA, Vance Duncan, posted, the fire department needs to involve code enforcement, building inspections, and the planning boards, and the whole process. No individual silos. Do you have a comment to that, Chris?
Yeah, that becomes the significant challenge. I think what we're seeing here today is the disconnect between the planning department, the inspectors, everything that was just described. When new construction, especially in high value structures that are being fast tracked to be built, and we're seeing this time and time again, that performance-based codes come into play. They now result in buildings that cannot be identifiable. They rely on a very delicate balance of things that we gave away relative to the codes that require a much greater degree of restriction. And we now are operating at risk. We may not have the personnel, we may not have the operational time, and we constantly see the challenges in protected properties that the buildings do not perform under fire conditions as expected from the code and the buildings department standpoint. So we've got to have a bigger voice at the table, but sometimes we are dismissed, and that's a challenge.
Well, I'll make a comment here. During my tenure as a fire commissioner, I was asked to attend a statewide planning organization that had an annual event. And one of the speakers before me spoke about the great plans he had in the community where he was the master planner. And he went on and on and on. And I normally wouldn't ask the question, but I asked him at the end of his presentation, is your local fire department involved in any of this planning? And his answer to me was no. And I said, so in other words, the fire chief's driving down the street and he sees you're going to put in a 6 or 7 story building, and he has to stop somewhere and say, hey, what are you building here? And now he has to try to decide what he's going to do going forward to deal with a 6 or 7 story building he never had in his first 2 area before. Yeah. I never got invited back by that group to speak again.
That's certainly the case. Absolutely. No question about that. Document and document. That's the other words of wisdom at all levels, especially the inspectors. Document what you see, communicate that up through the chain, but put your files away and get those files back home in a protected area, because when the bad things end up happening, someone's going to be held accountable, and you don't want to be the guy holding the bag, either at the chief's level at the planning level or the inspector level, all the way down the standpoint.
Yeah. Donna Dingler commented, this is very informative and makes you think about how what I must do in scenarios. We must clearly understand the building when possible and pre-plan. Uh, I like it when you do your classes on the street where you're taking people on a walkthrough through the towns, and I can guarantee you the firefighters leave there with a much more better and greater understanding of building construction after they take one of your street tours.
Again, I encourage our listeners, get out and take a look. If you don't understand what you may be seeing, if you've got a little bit of knowledge, at least get that forward. And the stuff that you don't know, reach out to get accurate technical information. But it's better. It's a combination of two things. But once you get into the built environment and are able to stand and look at cracks in a wall, take a look at displacement on different conditions, and understand construction, get into basement, into the roof areas, especially in the phasing of construction, that is worth beyond its weight in gold relative to what we now apply on the Fireground if you have that building intel knowledge on the front end.
We have a comment in here. Thanks for the information. Chris, you said it at the very beginning, and I couldn't agree more. We didn't even come close to scratching the surface on the education and the training that the fire service needs to have related to building construction, especially in today's modern environment. And we talked earlier today about maybe in the fall doing another program with you, and we will definitely have to get that scheduled. Another thank you, enhancing decision making, strengthening operational strategies on the Fireground. Julie Phelps wants you at their fire school.
There we go.
Uh,
Reach out.
so a lot of the comments, the books you listed, uh, so just so for our listeners, so I don't forget, there'll be several different attachments that Sam will send tomorrow in a PDF format. Uh, Chris, if you could have those slides that have those books
I
on it.
will. I actually just made a note on that. I'll get that together.
Okay.
I've got a couple of other little documents that I'll add to it, but yeah, I'll
Okay.
reference certainly the Building Construction Illustrated book. Also, for our listeners, there is a Building Construction for Codes illustrated book. So again, when you want to tie some things in that are illustrative, there's also a standalone that ties directly into the 2018 International Building and Fire Code that has a wealth of information. So if you really want to be integrated here, I'll also list that out. So Ching also puts together an aspect that now gives you the illustrative elements of how the codes are written and what they mean. So some really good insights on that.
All right. So when Sam sends his email out to all of you tomorrow, thanking you for joining us, there'll be links. There'll be some PowerPoint or PDFs attached to it. Chris's contact information will also be in that email. And the list of books that you were asking for will be there as well. And at the end of the day, if you get the information tomorrow and there's something more you want, you can either get back to me or you can go directly to Chris because his email address will also be in the email Sam sends tomorrow. So under the Q&A, Vince Mulray, Chris, love your
Oh, there
program.
we go.
One comment taken from the NIOS, tactics must match conditions worth mentioning.
Yeah. Chief
And
Mulroy is a great guy. I worked with, and actually he's been a guest on many of our podcast programs. But again, some firsthand insights. If you ever have a chance to listen to Chief Mulray's presentation on the York Avenue fire, York Street fire, double line of duty death in Philly, of which we referenced with the double line of duty death and that risk management, does a great job. So bring him in if you're anywhere here on the East Coast, as far as bring him in for a class. So some good stuff.
all right. And then the one slide you showed with the five-story building and the two smaller buildings, you know, the picture showed an HVAC system on the older legacy roofs that were never designed when built, 50 to 100 years ago.
Exactly. Yep.
It's certainly something to keep an eye on. So, Chris, I do want to make a comment. You mentioned several times Fireground experience. And I know we're going a little over 2 hours an hour, and that's fine. So if memory serves me right, from the fire dynamics classes I've taken, the number of fires in the United States have dropped dramatically, yet the number of injuries to firefighters have increased over that same period of time. I can tell you when I got involved in the fire service in the 70s and through the early 80s, it was a standard that I could expect to see 4 or 5 working fires in a volunteer department
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
month. Now the younger folks that are coming into the business, they might be in the fire department 2 or 3 years before they see their first working fire. So if we're not having the Fireground experience, where do these people need to pick up the experience since we don't have the number of fires we once did? Any suggestions?
Well, part of that too. So if you're not getting it, I always encourage, and this is something that was an attribute that I was told about. So if you're not getting it, go to other jurisdictions that are. So sometimes the proximity to other departments that may be having more work, be an observer. You would be surprised if you know what you're looking at, that you can gain this quote unquote experience sort of indirectly by observing fire behavior, fire practices. It's much more than just watching the fire. You've got to be much more intuitive into that, ask the questions, post incident insights, and so forth. But there's no easy way to actually substitute experience, but there's also simulations. There's a variety of things that I think technology is providing us with a robust degree of potential insights, but to be able to experience the conditions within the compartment, within a fire floor, nothing can take the place of experience. But we have to have an appreciation for what we encounter. And when there's this degree of uncertainty, utilize conservative bias to figure out, do I continue to press forward? Do I take a different position? What does that mean? So we've got to correlate the conditions of that environment with these degrees of unknown, but have some insights on what it's meaning. So we gain some insights through the book learning, through the simulations, through the lecturing, the audible, the visual indicators by watching what others are doing. Yes, there is a value of looking at online video to a certain extent. So I think in this day and age, you've got to take a look at all of them, connect those dots, and be able to utilize them appropriately in the environment when you're confronted with those on the job.
And to your point, even if you can't actually ride along with a larger metro department and actively participate in fire suppression, being able to ride along maybe with a command officer and being able to ask questions and observe what goes on and is another way to pick up that practical experience that you just can't get these days that we used to get because we don't have the number of fires that we once did.
Well, that goes back into the whole issue of this recognition prime decision making or naturalist decision making. How do how do experienced commanders sometimes know by reading the fireground, watching the conditions, listening to communications, and be proactive to make certain decisions before the bad things happen? That comes through the repetition of the experience level. So, yes, there's a tremendous value in listening to the war stories, but utilize those things beyond just the war story part of it. You know, probe and ask more leading questions of why is this and that, what prompted you to think this way, or what is it about something that you're seeing that has some relationship there. So it's a very fluid, it's an engaging process that really has no end. So
At the end of the day, never stop learning. So I'm going to make one last comment here from Dixon Armistead. Working with mutual aid departments is very important. It's important to know what resources are available to you and them. Also, they may have different construction.
yeah. So
So
yeah, the importance of what of your first due. Sometimes you got a good handle of what's going on in your first due. It's the problems on that second, third, or fourth alarm mutual aid area that you've got to have some better insights on. So yeah, absolutely. You always got to be looking over your shoulder or looking a couple of miles down the road.
Well, Chris, I truly appreciate your time tonight, and I appreciate the fact those of you that joined us at 7 o'clock are still with us. I want to remind our audience there'll be a brief survey we'd like you to complete. Keep an eye open in your email that'll have your certificate of attendance attached for tonight's webinar. You'll get it sometime tomorrow morning. Again, tonight's episode will be uploaded to providentins.com. You'll receive a link to that in the email within the next day. Please, and I beg you, please check your spam folder or your junk email that you didn't receive your certificate before you email me and tell me you didn't get it. For those who are using the webinar as a training for a group of people, when you receive the thank you email from Sam, there'll be an Excel spreadsheet attached. Please use this to send the names and email addresses to us for certificates. It makes life much easier for me when I'm doing the certificates. You can view previous webinars at www.providentins.com and use the training resources link in the upper right-hand corner of the page. As I mentioned earlier, April the 27th, we'll be having a panel discussion with people from the Volunteer Combination Officer section about what makes good leaders great. May the 27th, Steve Hirsch, who is the chairman of the National Volunteer Fire Council, will be doing a webinar on firefighter health and safety related to cancer cardiac. And June the 23rd, Ray McCormack and Mike Holt are going to do a webinar on water mapping, surface coverage, and the technology behind the hen nozzle that so many people are seeing these days. So until we meet again, stay safe for your family's sake.